Hello. Welcome to Kindly Neurodivergent with Kay. This show is to spend quality time with each other, kindly discussing the similarities and wide range of differences we experience. The experiences we discuss on this show are for educational purposes only. Please do not substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Before we begin, I respectfully request that if you witness any pauses during this show, please continue watching. I'm composing a spontaneous comment or question, someone processing their thoughts, in addition to repeating something that was unintelligible or misunderstood. It is natural discourse, and we can choose not to say anything while this is occurring. I want to shout out my mom for today. I have Morgan Conway with me. She is here with me to discuss transitioning from high school to college for students with neurodivergence. Morgan Conway, campus lead for the Office for Disability and Accessibility Services at Connecticut State Community College, Quinebaug Valley, is passionate about serving the community college system and its constituents. Pursuing her PhD in educational leadership at Springfield College, her research focuses on the experiences of neurodiverse individuals and college communities. Morgan holds an MA in educational leadership with a focus in higher education and student affairs, and a graduate certificate in post-secondary disability services from the University of Connecticut. She aims to support and challenge students to realize their full potential academically and socially, while encouraging them to remain socially conscious and compassionate members of their communities. Morgan enjoys cooking, gardening, exploring new hiking trails near water, and cherishing time with her husband, daughter, and their pets, Daisy the cat and Richie the dog. Welcome, Morgan.
Thank you, Kayla. And I will say, I have Richie the dog right at my feet. So if there's any barking, forgive me in advance.
Please introduce yourself.
Sure thing. Um, that bio tells, I think, a lot about me. I am Morgan Conway. I currently serve as the campus lead for the Office for Disability and Accessibility Services at CT State Quinebaug Valley. I um, I have been doing this work, working with college students who are neurodivergent or college students with disabilities, as we kind of call them in the field, and we'll get into that later. Um, the identity piece. I have been doing this for my entire professional career, and so this is something that I love. I do it as a job, but it really is so much of my life. And I like to share the example of I got married 3 years ago, and on my honeymoon in Vienna, Austria, there was a mural, a sort of, that might not be the right word, like a billboard campaign about accessibility. And my sweet new husband had to bear with me because I was so excited and wanted to engage in the accessibility campaign. And thankfully, he's very much into history, so he found other things to do that day. But it's a good example of this is really core to who I am. I was raised by two educators who work with neurodivergent individuals, and I don't really remember a time in my life when I wasn't either doing what I'm doing in some capacity in terms of this service, or thinking about doing it or studying doing it. And so I think
Agreed, I love doing this work.
exactly. And I think people like you and I find each other in this work, right? It's the reason that we got connected is because of another part of this work and belonging as a person who's neurodivergent. And I just think that that's, yeah. I know I'll talk more than enough over the next few minutes together. So
I'm
I'll
Kid
digress.
Ireland. I have cerebral palsy. Should neurodivergent individuals start looking at colleges earlier than their neurotypical peers?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Kayla. Should neurodivergent individuals start looking at colleges earlier than their neurotypical peers? Yes and no. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to give you a definite answer, right? Because every person, neurodivergent or not, is different. And so I think for me to answer this, I would really ask that each individual person ask themselves, or if you're the parent or caregiver or friend, ask your friend or child or student this question. But you know, do you have a really specific college or career or major that you want to study or go into? And if so, how selective is that program, right? So, do you need to be putting in a couple more years of prep to get into it, to consider the areas that or the prerequisites that that program or college entails? If so, then yes, you should start looking at colleges before maybe your peers. But I would say the same thing to a neurotypical student, right? If this student is passionate about becoming a veterinarian and they know, abilities aside, they know that veterinary school is challenging to get into, and they want to maybe go into this program for undergrad that can support them going into that journey, then yeah, we need to be preparing for this a little bit earlier. But with that said, I have two caveats. The first one is students, generally speaking, I think we ask a lot of people when we ask them to make these decisions kind of early in life, right? We're asking students in high school a lot of the time, well, what are you going to do next year? Or what are you going to do in 2 years? And that can be a really high pressure question for anyone, but especially for where we are developmentally at, 14 to 18. And then also for speaking of our neurodivergent students and children, a really big question for them. And so should they start looking at colleges
I
earlier?
started as a sophomore or junior.
You did? Tell me more. I'm sorry.
I started as a sophomore or junior, I believe.
Which is a good age. I mean, I think that's the good age. I hate to say that there's an average or a norm, but if there were, I think it would be right in there. You probably knew before your sophomore year, I want to go into higher ed, or I definitely don't, right? So you were already thinking about it in a lot of ways, even if it wasn't necessarily researching colleges, right?
One questioned my mother for calling early on my behalf. Another college wanted my mother to pay tuition for herself because she would be taking up a seat in the classroom as my personal assistant.
No way. So I think you're sharing a really good example of some students that probably do want to look a little bit earlier, right? Because I don't want to say it, but I'm going to say it. That's like a scam almost. And so thankfully, you and your mom got together, knew that that wasn't allowed, knew that you needed to take some action steps, and that takes additional time, right? And so, I mean, to that point, it is always good. I'm a planner, so I'm always going to say do it as early as possible. You are too.
Each student directing their disability-related needs is important as they are self-advocating.
Yep.
Please talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a big difference between high school and college, that Kayla, you've probably heard in your own studies or anytime any of us in our offices talk about it. I feel like we're almost like hitting people over the head with it, maybe too much.
Yeah.
But your journey as a student in every office, right? This isn't specific to disability and accessibility services. This is, you're a college student now. The ball's in your court, right? Theoretically or proverbially or whatever we want to call it. Um, and so we have things like the FERPA form, right? The oh my goodness, Federal Education Rights and Protection Act. Don't quote me on that. But students have to physically sign, and I know it's all on technology these days, but indicate who, when, where, and why the college can communicate with people other than that student, even if it is a parent who's been heavily involved in your life so far, right? And so I use that example because it's just one part of the college student experience that shows you, like, financial aid uses FERPA, ODAS, disability and accessibility services. That's my area. We actually say that we only communicate with the student. However, the student is always welcome to bring another member into the conversation. And so I think that student directed piece is really just about the two things, right? It's one, legally, you're the adult. Even if you are underage when you attend college, you are legally treated as the adult. And two, it's good self advocacy. I think whether you're neurodiverse or neurotypical or somewhere in between, because I do believe everything in life is a spectrum, we are, you and me, we're on the same wavelength here. Um, I think that everybody really needs some sort of, oh my gosh, I lost my train of thought. Everything in life. Oh, reminder, right? The reminder that we are the ones that are sort of in charge of our own destiny. And so part of that is advocating for ourselves and saying, hey, I need to engage in this project. I need to start this process. I have a question. And so while that can be really challenging, I like to say to my students, in a lot of ways, this is what we've been training for, right? The ability to, and we've learned from our parents and our caregivers and our teachers, and they're still, I use a bus as a metaphor. They're still on the bus, but now I'm driving the bus as the student. And so they're on the bus. Now I'm adding my director of ODAS. I'm adding a disability service provider. All the instructors that I'm taking this semester are all in the
Would
bus
parent
too.
caregiver involvement and communication be considered?
Say that one more time. I'm sorry.
When would parent caregiver involvement and communication be considered?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what I was getting at. There's times that students say, hey Morgan, maybe I have a significant past trauma and I get really worked up when I'm talking about it, but I know I need to talk about it in order to share the accommodations that I need with you. Can we do my intake appointment with my therapist on the phone so that if I feel like I'm getting overwhelmed, I can kind of like use that or address some coping mechanisms in order to process the rest of the intake appointment. And I think that's one example. Another is our parents, right? Those of us that have children or are someone's child, in a lot of ways, our parents are our first and only advocates for a very long time. I have a new baby of my own, and my mother-in-law always tells me she's just a baby right now. You're her only advocate. And I think in 18 years, I'm going to be like, what are you talking about? I can't attend this meeting with my child. Right. But the reality is that if my child wants me there, then I can go. However, there is a little bit of that disconnect where I have to be okay that I have educated this person and taught them to advocate for themselves in a lot of ways as well. And so I wouldn't say that it's not appropriate to have a parent or a caregiver or a therapist or a friend attend with a student, but it is still that student initiated process. And I think that that's the piece that we have to keep reminding ourselves.
Do you ever recommend?
Do I recommend? Oh, Kaylee, you're hitting me with some really hard questions tonight. Um, I guess the short answer again is yes and no. I think yes, if you're somebody who would benefit, it's so hot. A lot of this work is so individualized, and I know you know that because you're passionate about working with people with neurodiversity as well. It's different for every person. I think for one student it might be really beneficial to maybe they're soft spoken or they weren't really heavily involved in the what's the word I'm looking for, in the accommodations process as a high school student, and so they just don't know. Then yes, you should have somebody there that can kind of back you up, right? Phone a friend is what I like to call it.
We
um
have to approach your office to receive support. What does
yeah.
that process look like?
Yeah. So we try to make it as accessible, pun intended, as possible by having it be an online intake form. So if it's 2 in the morning and you're thinking, oh my gosh, I just remembered I never registered to request accommodations. I know for me, my 2 a.m. thoughts are usually not there anymore at 8 a.m. So I like to think of it as if you wake up in the middle of the night with that thought, you're like, oh gosh, we're 3 weeks into the semester. I'm already behind. You can log in and do it right then. And we're going to see it the next morning if it's a Monday through a Friday. Um, Sometimes it might be a couple days, but that I think is an important piece of it being a student initiated process is that the student can start the process whenever they want, wherever they want, from a cell phone, from a computer, from a tablet. If they are on campus and it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon and they're just like, Morgan, I need accommodations, then I'm gonna start the process with them in person as well. But we're gonna get that confidential file built online. And I think that's an important part of being a student initiated process.
What documentation provided by the student do you need to allow a student to receive support?
Great question. It varies. There's a common theme to my answers here. It's really on a case by case basis. So if we're having a student that's requesting, um, exam accommodations, we're going to want documentation that addresses the need for the exam accommodation, right? What is the diagnosis? How does it impact your major life function, right? So what are some of our major life functions? Eating, breathing, sleeping, thinking. The list could go on, so I'll digress on that point. But the diagnosis, major life function, and then if the provider has suggestions of accommodations, what has the student used in the past that worked well? What might not have worked well? Is this a math related learning disability? Okay, then do they need their accommodations in an English or a science course? And so some of that is sort of what we're looking for. But like I said, it really is so individualized in that I'm going to look at you. I'm going to use you as my example, Kayla. I'm going to look at you as the person in front of me and what you're sharing with me during your self report or what I call an intake appointment, what you've put on that online intake form at maybe at 2 in the morning. And then what have you submitted so far? And this is sort of like my puzzle, and I'm not a big puzzle person, but I'll pretend that I am right now. This is my puzzle that I'm putting together to determine what's reasonable for the college, right? Because we're not giving away free, well, we do free education, but that's different. We're not giving away free grades, I should say.
Can it be a letter from family or friend?
Great question. Generally speaking, no, right? We want it to come from a medical provider. Um, excuse me, I'm getting over a little bit of a cold. We want it to come from a medical provider. However, we all know that some of our friends or family are doctors and physicians. I have had students who have said, well, my father is my primary care. And so, I mean, I will not share my own opinion on that piece, but in that case, I would hope that the student has access to a non-family member physician that can speak to their current level of functioning.
Why?
Good question. I think biases are present in everything that we do. Um, and there is a level of care and love that we have for our family members and those closest to us that inevitably is going to show through. And so, to ensure that we're providing an equitable and accessible process to all students, having clear documentation from an unbiased or as unbiased as we can get individual is imperative to ensuring that reasonable and appropriateness of the process.
How are reasonable accommodations different from high school being obligated to meet most student needs?
Yeah, so the big difference between high school and college is, and Kayla, you and I have talked about this ahead of our conversation tonight, but the structured in high school versus unstructured in college. And so some of that is what we've talked about so far. Students in college are required to self-disclose and say, hi, I want accommodations, and start the process. It's also different in that a student with a disability, a student experiencing neurodiversity, a student sort of anywhere on the on the spectrum of neurodiversity might go through college with never requesting accommodations. They wouldn't necessarily have that opportunity in high school. So, or I should say pre-K through 12. So at in the pre-K, excuse me, in the pre-K through 12 environment, students are identified and for them, right? And saying, this student has a disability. We need to get an IEP going. We need to get a 504 going. We're going to make sure that this happens. We're contacting the parents. Every teacher knows about the accommodations no matter what. A lot of the times the teachers know what the student's disability is. And there is nothing wrong with that because again, we're talking about really vulnerable students from the ages of 4 to 18 or 22 in some cases who need to have that sort of support in order to get to this other side, this other end of the spectrum and be able to go to college and say, I can advocate for myself. And so that kind of addresses the structured and unstructured piece. Did I answer your
Well, I
question?
had a familiar paraprofessional, therapies, access to a laptop or desktop, adaptive keyboard and joystick velcroed down on an appropriate table height for my wheelchair, a paper and book stand, wheelchair, walker, AFOS, and extra time as needed. On my college accommodation letter, I have double time for assessments, access to a note taker, a scribe for written assessments, accessible furniture and classroom, and verbal participation alternatives.
Yeah. So that shows kind of some of the differences, right? And what has that experience, do you mind me asking? Well, first of all, thank you for sharing that. And secondly, what has that experience or transition sort of looked like for you?
Fine. Except the therapy part.
Mm-hmm. The college not providing it is what you're saying. Yeah.
Why are you not required to provide tutors, attendants, and paraprofessionals unless provided for all students?
Great question. It's the way that the law, so I wish I had a visual, right? It's actually, I'm in my house, but it's in my office. I have the visual of the ADA and the IDEA, the primary laws that protect students in pre-K through 12 and then in higher education. And so bear with me. I want to find one resource so that I can say it correctly. But the long and the short of it is the IDEA is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And that's what's protecting our students or serving our students, I should say, from pre-K through 12. It is FAPE, FAPE, so free and accessible public education. Whereas the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, is what we are primarily governed by in higher education. And that's where it's the Americans. Oh, I already said that. I'm sorry. It's the Americans with Disabilities Act. But what we're required to do is provide access, whereas the IDEA is required to ensure success. And that's a really contentious point for a lot of people because, including our faculty and the professors in the college, because it can be really hard when you're kind of reading an accommodation letter and feeling like these accommodations are good, but they're not necessarily enough, right? We're not providing the therapies, we're not providing a tutor, we're not, and I don't know that I have the right answer for that other than that's what the differentiation is, the access versus success, and that piece of the reasonable and appropriateness, and who the burden, I don't love the term, but we call it like the burden to provide.
I don't like the wording of extension process.
The wording of extension process. Can you tell me more?
I have never used extension for assignments because I feel like it's not straightforward.
Oh, the description or like the words in the description. Yeah, that's a tough one because I think we find in a lot of ways that because accommodations are case by case, course by course, student by student, they can't be straightforward necessarily because they have to be discussed every single time. And so, yeah, exactly. I am inclined to say you should speak to your campus disability service provider. Um, but yeah, that's a tough one.
Thank you, Morgan, for doing this with me.
Of course.
It was great to have you on. Please share this talk show with your family, friends, students, and colleagues. Everyone watching, don't forget to like, follow, subscribe,